There's a kind of calm that doesn't come from serenity, but from survival. The kind you only earn after life has pushed you past every version of yourself that used to scream, defend, panic, or perform. These past weeks, while I was silent here, life pulled me into a space where speaking felt impossible. Not because I disappeared, but because I was being remade. In that quiet, everything I'd been avoiding finally caught up to me. The expectations, the noise, the people I kept trying to carry, the truths I kept trying not to see, and for the first time, I stopped running. I stopped explaining myself to people who were never really listening. I stopped fighting storms that were never mine to fix. Something in me broke, but in a way that brought clarity instead of chaos. A clarity that strips away illusions, people, and identities you never realized you were still holding on to. A clarity that hurts before it heals. And in that breaking, I became calm. Not the soft kind, not the blissful, meditative kind, the hard-earned calm. The kind that costs you attachments, reactions, and versions of yourself you outgrew long ago. The kind that feels less like peace and more like awakening. So no, this isn't a story about disappearing. This is the story of what I became in the silence, and the price I paid for finally finding a calm that couldn't be taken from me. People look at someone calm and assume it's natural, like they were born steady, unaffected, untouched by chaos. But calm isn't something you're born with. It's something life carves into you when you've run out of other choices. Before I ever learned to be calm, I was the opposite. I felt everything loudly. I overthought, over-explained, over-cared. I reacted to things that didn't deserve reactions, tried to fix what wasn't mine, tried to hold together what was already broken. And the more I tried, the more life kept reminding me of a truth I didn't want to hear. Not everything can be saved. Not everyone can be understood. Not every storm is yours to fight. My silence these past weeks wasn't accidental. It wasn't laziness or lack of ideas. It was life pulling me into a deeper room inside myself. A room where you can't run, can't distract yourself, can't pretend you're fine. Where everything you've been avoiding sits across from you and asks, "Are you finally ready to listen?" That's where the shift happened, not in some peaceful sunrise moment, but in the middle of exhaustion, disappointment, and emotional burnout I didn't see coming. And that's where calm began for me, not as peace, but as clarity. The clarity that comes when you finally stop fighting reality. The clarity that shows you who's draining you, what's costing you energy, and what parts of yourself you've been betraying just to keep the world around you comfortable. The kind of clarity that first feels like loss, before you realize it's freedom. So when people say, "You're so calm," I wish they knew the truth. This calm wasn't gifted. It was earned, painfully, quietly, alone. There's a moment in every awakening that doesn't look dramatic on the outside, but on the inside, it marks the point where your entire life quietly rearranges itself. For me, it didn't happen during a crisis, or a breakdown, or some cinematic turning point. It happened in a quieter place, somewhere between exhaustion and clarity. I remember realizing, almost with a strange sense of calm, that I couldn't live the way I'd been living anymore. Not with the same reactions, not with the same emotional patterns, not with the same urgency to fix or please or control what was never mine to manage. Something in me just stopped rushing, stopped defending, stopped explaining myself to people who weren't listening, stopped carrying weight that didn't belong to me. And that's the thing no one tells you about becoming calm. It doesn't start with wisdom. It starts with a kind of soul tiredness, a breaking point where the chaos becomes too heavy to keep feeding. I didn't wake up one day and become balanced. I burned out of my old self. I think a lot of people who appear calm on the outside have gone through that same invisible shift. They weren't always composed, they weren't always grounded, they weren't born peaceful. They grew into it after life pushed them past their threshold, after caring too much, thinking too much, pouring into the wrong people, losing themselves in the wrong situations, and trying so hard to be understood by people who only heard their own echoes. At some point, the body says no more, the heart says no more, and the mind finally listens. That's when calmness starts forming, not as a personality trait, but as a survival instinct. You learn to stop putting your energy into places where it's wasted. You stop arguing with those who only want to win, not understand. You stop reacting to every emotional tug the world throws at you. You stop explaining your soul to people still committed to misunderstanding it. And once that shift happens, you begin to feel something you might not have felt in years. Space between the trigger and the reaction. Space between what someone says and what you decide it means. Space between the noise of the world and the clarity of your own inner voice. That space becomes everything. It becomes your sanctuary. It becomes the place where you breathe instead of break, observe instead of absorb, and people will notice it. They'll say you've changed. You're distant. You're colder. You're not the same. But what they're really seeing isn't distance, it's discernment. They're not watching you shut down. They're watching you wake up. Because once you've experienced the cost of reacting to everything, you start choosing differently. You start choosing yourself. And that's when calmness turns from survival into strength. Quiet, steady, unshakable strength. The kind you don't perform, the kind you simply become. There's a stage in growth that no one prepares you for. The stage where you realize most of your suffering didn't come from what happened to you, but from the way you kept fighting things you were never meant to control. I didn't become calm because life got easier. I became calm because I finally stopped wrestling with every wave that hit me. I used to react to everything. Every shift in someone's tone, every unanswered message, every change in atmosphere. I'd feel the tension in a room before a word was even spoken. I'd internalize other people's moods like it was my job to fix them. I lived in a state of constant emotional alertness, as if staying hyper-aware could protect me from disappointment. But awareness without boundaries is self-destruction. So at some point, I stopped fighting things that were draining me. I stopped fighting for clarity in relationships where confusion was the point. I stopped fighting to be understood by people who only listened for arguments, not truth. I stopped fighting for loyalty from people whose loyalty was conditional. I stopped fighting for peace in situations built on chaos. And most importantly, I stopped fighting myself, my sensitivity, my depth, my intuition. The parts of me I once called too much were never the problem. The environments I placed them in were. Most people don't talk about this part. The calm you see on the outside is often the result of the battles you no longer participate in. It's not passivity, it's discernment. It's choosing where your soul goes and where it doesn't. And once you make those choices, everything shifts. Suddenly you can sit with your feelings without drowning in them. You can hear criticism without collapsing. You can be alone without feeling abandoned. You can lose something and not lose yourself with it. That's when calm becomes a kind of internal gravity. Quiet but powerful, steady but unapologetic. You stop absorbing other people's storms. You let them rain without letting them flood you. And as strange as it sounds, the world starts to feel gentler when you no longer react to all its sharp edges. Things happen. People disappoint you. Plans fall apart. But you don't fall apart with them. You breathe. You observe. You adjust. Because you've finally learned that your peace is not a public space. It's not something anyone else gets to own or interrupt or rearrange. And the moment you learn that lesson, you reclaim a part of yourself you didn't know you'd lost. The part that can stand in the middle of chaos and remain intact. That's the calm people see. Not perfection, not indifference, but someone who has stopped fighting battles that don't lead anywhere and started choosing the ones that matter. When I stopped reacting to everything, something strange happened. The world didn't get quieter. I did. And from that quiet, things I'd never noticed before started appearing, like hidden ink showing up under heat. It wasn't some mystical awakening or spiritual epiphany. It was just perception, finally unfiltered. When you're no longer drowning in your own responses, you start seeing the responses of everyone else with a kind of clarity that's almost uncomfortable. You notice how often people confuse loudness with truth, how arguments are really just unprocessed wounds wearing language as armor, how most reactions aren't reactions at all, they're echoes. Echoes of childhood, echoes of insecurity, echoes of fears no one has ever said out loud. The more still I became, the more I could feel the fracture points in people, the tiny invisible places where their voice tightens, where their eyes flicker, where their energy collapses for half a second before the mask snaps back on. Not to judge it, just to finally see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start realizing how much of the world is built on tension disguised as personality. You hear the apology inside someone's anger, the exhaustion inside someone's confidence, the loneliness hiding under someone's jokes. Calmness turns you into a quiet witness to human truth. It's not a superpower. It's just what happens when you're no longer the loudest thing in your own head. And that shift, it changes everything. You stop taking things personally because you finally see that most of what people say is directed at the ghosts behind you, not at you at all. You stop matching other people's intensity because you can feel that their intensity isn't about the moment. It's about the story they've been carrying for years. You stop trying to fix people because you understand, maybe for the first time, that clarity is not cure. That seeing someone is not the same as saving them. And maybe the hardest part is realizing how many places you used to lose yourself. How often you bent your truth to keep the peace. How many conversations you weren't actually part of. You were just managing someone else's emotions so they wouldn't turn on you. But when you stop reacting, you start choosing. Choosing where your energy goes. Choosing what deserves your voice. Choosing who gets access to your clarity. And that choice becomes a kind of X-ray vision. You see through apologies that aren't real. You feel the difference between presence and performance. You notice who listens and who waits for their turn to speak. You notice who wants understanding and who wants dominance. You see patterns instead of incidents. Intentions instead of words. Truth instead of noise. And with that vision comes a subtle shift, not in the world, but in you. You stop chasing the comfort of belonging in places that require you to dim yourself. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop letting chaos choose your direction. You become deliberate, measured, quiet in a way that feels powerful, not passive. Because once you start seeing people clearly, you also start seeing yourself clearly. Where you used to overreact, you now observe. Where you used to collapse, you now breathe. Where you used to internalize, you now understand. Calmness stops being a response and becomes a lens, a way of seeing that no longer makes you fragile. It makes you free. And freedom, real freedom, begins the moment you finally understand what never deserved your reaction in the first place. There's a moment in this journey where calmness stops feeling like survival and starts feeling like strength. Not the loud kind, not the heroic kind, but the quiet, unsettling kind that even you don't fully recognize at first. It begins when you realize how often chaos used to pull you around by the throat, how easily one comment, one tone of voice, one misunderstanding could hijack your whole nervous system, and then one day it just doesn't. Not because you've become numb, but because your awareness has grown sharper than the moment itself. You start noticing the space between what happens and how you respond, and that space keeps expanding. It becomes a room you can step into, a room where you can breathe, think, feel, and choose instead of react. That room is where your power lives. People think calmness is a personality trait, something you're either born with or not, but the truth is more personal, more painful. Calm people are forged, not gifted. Their stillness is built from nights where they wanted to scream but didn't, days where they held their own breaking without letting it spill into the world. Their restraint isn't silence, it's self-respect. It's knowing their energy is too expensive to spend recklessly. And when you reach that point, something shifts in how people respond to you, not always positively. Some feel threatened when they can't provoke you anymore. Some get louder when you stop reacting to their noise. Some confuse your calm for indifference because they cannot imagine a form of strength that doesn't look like domination. But others, the ones who are awake, the ones who have lived through their own storms, they recognize the quiet fire in you. They feel the steadiness in your presence, the emotional gravity that doesn't need to announce itself. Because calmness, real calmness, makes you unpredictable in a world built on predictable reactions. People don't know what to do with someone who refuses to feed their chaos, someone who listens but doesn't absorb, who understands but doesn't get pulled under. And that's when you begin to understand the true nature of calm. It wasn't meant to make you invulnerable. It was meant to make you untouchable, not emotionally dead, but emotionally sovereign. You're no longer controlled by other people's storms, but you're also not separated from them. You're just anchored. And that anchoring changes the way you love, the way you connect, the way you let people in. You stop giving access to those who mistake your patience for permission. You stop letting people treat your kindness like a soft spot when it's actually a boundary. You stop apologizing for the silence you need to stay sane. And the more you do that, the more calmness stops being a shield and becomes a weapon. Not to hurt others, but to protect yourself from the versions of you that used to bleed for everyone. Calmness becomes the language of your evolution. A way of saying, I'm not who I used to be, and I refuse to return to the version of me that lived in constant reaction. And the deeper truth is this: you didn't become calm because life got easier. You became calm because you stopped allowing life to hijack every part of you. Your strength isn't in how loudly you fight back. It's in how little the world can pull you away from yourself now. And that kind of strength, it takes time. It takes loss. It takes every version of you that ever fell apart. But once it's yours, it doesn't leave. And that's when you finally understand. Calmness isn't the absence of storms. It's learning you were the storm all along, just one that no longer needs to destroy to feel powerful. The strange thing about becoming calm is that people think it means you don't need anyone anymore. As if stillness somehow replaces connection, as if being grounded means being detached. But calm people, the real calm ones, carry a quiet ache that almost no one sees. Because the truth is, underneath the steadiness, underneath the clarity and the boundaries and the silence, there is still a part of you that wants to belong, not to chaos, not to noise, but to something real, something safe enough to take the armor off, and that longing never disappears. It just hides behind the discipline. It lingers in the pauses between breaths, in the way you pick your words carefully, in the way you listen more than you speak. It's an ache for someone who won't punish your honesty or misread your calmness as distance. But this world doesn't make that easy. Because the calmer you become, the more you see how fragile most relationships are. How much of connection is built on shared distraction, shared wounds, shared panic. And when you stop reacting, you stop participating in that dance, you become the quiet one in a room full of emotional noise, and people project everything onto quiet. Some assume you're judging them, some assume you think you're better, some assume you don't care. Calmness becomes a mirror they don't want to look into. And still, despite all this, a part of you wants to be held, seen, understood. You want someone who speaks your language, not the language of drama or urgency or impulse, but the language of depth, of patience, of emotional truth. Someone who doesn't get scared when you go quiet. Someone who doesn't mistake peace for boredom. Someone who isn't threatened by a mind that refuses to rush. But wanting that doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Calmness didn't kill your need for connection. It just killed your tolerance for shallow versions of it. Before you could force yourself to fit into the noise. Now you can't. Before you could pretend that any closeness was better than none. Now you'd rather sit alone in silence than sit with someone who can't meet you where you are, and that's the cost no one talks about. Calmness refines your heart but narrows your circle. It deepens your soul but empties your table. It makes you wiser but lonelier, not because you're hard to love, but because you can no longer settle for a love that requires you to abandon yourself. You start recognizing how often you gave parts of yourself away just to feel included, and how quietly your peace was drained by people who only knew how to connect through conflict. Calmness forces you to be honest about the relationships you used to tolerate, the ones where you weren't heard, just useful, the ones where you weren't understood, just convenient, the ones where your silence was taken as permission instead of protection, and losing those connections hurts, even if you know it's right. But here's the truth you grow into. You can't belong everywhere. Not anymore. Not after everything you've seen. Not after everything you've grown through. The calm version of you needs a different kind of space, a different kind of intimacy, a different kind of honesty. The kind that doesn't collapse under truth. The kind that doesn't punish depth. The kind that feels like coming home, not performing. And those people, the ones who can sit with your silence, who don't need to fill every moment, who don't get scared when your emotions don't explode, they're rare but they're real. And they find you by resonance, not by proximity. They show up when you stop chasing noise. They appear when you stop shrinking to stay acceptable. They arrive when you finally realize that being calm doesn't mean being alone. It means clearing enough space for the right people to find you. And until they do, your calmness is your companion, your anchor, your quiet loyalty to yourself. Because the truth is simple, you're not hard to love. You're just done loving in places where you have to disappear to be chosen. There comes a moment in every awakening where you stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and you start asking, "What is this teaching me?" Because calmness, the real kind, isn't just a coping mechanism. It's a shift in identity. It's the moment you realize your nervous system isn't wired for chaos anymore, that your spirit refuses to participate in noise that once felt normal. And at first, it feels like you're losing pieces of yourself. But slowly, you start to understand that the version of you who reacted to everything wasn't the truest version. It was the most afraid version, the most unprotected version, the one who didn't know there was another way to exist. And once you realize that, calmness stops being a mystery and becomes a map of everything you've outgrown, of everything you no longer pretend to enjoy, of every place where your soul refused to shrink again. Calmness becomes a signpost of who you are turning into. Someone who doesn't need to defend themselves to feel real. Someone who doesn't need loudness to feel seen. Someone who doesn't need chaos to feel alive. And that shift is powerful, not because it makes life easier, but because it makes you impossible to drag back into the patterns that once kept you small. You start recognizing your old reactions like ghosts. The impulse to argue, the need to explain, the urge to control outcomes. You feel them rise, like muscle memory. But now you know better. You can watch the emotion without becoming it. You can feel the trigger without collapsing into it. You can hold the tension without bursting. And that's when calmness becomes more than peace. It becomes mastery. Emotional mastery, identity mastery. A level of self-awareness that lets you see the storm without losing the center. And once you have that, something beautiful happens. Chaos stops choosing you. The same situations that once pulled you into drama suddenly lose their power. The same people who once activated you now reveal themselves without effort. You start seeing intentions instead of words, patterns instead of excuses, truth instead of theatrics. And the more you see, the less you chase. You stop running after conversations that don't hear you. You stop proving your worth to people who never valued silence. You stop fighting battles that only exist in someone else's mind. You start understanding that calmness isn't the absence of reaction, it's the presence of clarity, and clarity is a filter. It filters out noise, it filters out manipulation, it filters out anyone who was only attached to the version of you that didn't know how to say no, and that's why calmness feels like losing everything at first. Because it clears the room, it clears your life of everything that required the old you, the reactive you, the anxious you, the over-explaining you, just to function. But then, in that cleared out space, you begin to notice something subtle. You can hear yourself again, your real voice, the one that isn't shaped by fear or urgency, the one that knows exactly what you need, what you believe, what you want to build next. And for the first time, calmness feels less like an ending and more like a beginning rooted in sovereignty, in choosing yourself without guilt, without apology, without shrinking. Because calmness is not the disappearance of emotion, it's the full return of self. The version of you that doesn't get swept away by every wave, but can finally decide which waves are worth riding. The version of you that doesn't run from discomfort, but listens to what it's trying to say. The version of you that knows peace is not passive. It's intentional, it's courageous, it's earned. And what you start to realize, slowly, quietly, is that becoming calm didn't cost you your fire. It gave you the clarity to aim it. Your calmness isn't your disappearance. It's your becoming. What most people will never understand is that calmness isn't the absence of storms. It's the ability to hold them without letting anyone see the damage. Calm people look steady on the outside, but inside there are waves crashing that no one ever hears. And maybe that's the part that hurts the most. The world assumes calmness means invulnerability, that your silence means you're unaffected, that your steadiness means you don't break. But calmness has never meant immunity. It has always meant endurance, emotional endurance, spiritual endurance, the kind you earn by surviving things no one else knows about because you never let it spill out loud. Calm people carry 1,000 unspoken moments, the arguments they walked away from, the truths they swallowed because speaking them would have broken someone, the pain they processed alone because the world kept mistaking their composure for being fine. Calmness becomes a shield, yes, but it's also a language, a way of saying, I will not let this turn me into something I'm not. And that takes strength, a quiet, visceral strength that doesn't announce itself, because while everyone else is yelling their feelings into the world, calm people are sitting with theirs, sorting through them, learning from them, refusing to let chaos dictate their character. But that doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. They feel so deeply that reacting to every emotion would burn them alive. So they hold it, they breathe through it, they let it pass through their chest like a wave hitting rock, never shattering but leaving cracks that no one sees. And that's the hidden burden. Calm people are often the ones who break in silence. They're the ones who cry when no one is watching, the ones who collapse only behind closed doors, the ones who get back up before anyone even realizes they were on their knees. They're not hiding because they're ashamed. They're hiding because they've learned that not everyone deserves access to their vulnerability. Calmness becomes a boundary. I choose where my energy goes and who gets to touch it. And most people don't understand that kind of restraint. They confuse quiet strength with emotional distance. They think lack of reaction means lack of care. But it's the opposite. Calm people care so much that they refuse to let their instinctive reactions harm anyone, including themselves. They carry everything inward so the world doesn't have to. They absorb more than they express. They forgive more than they reveal. They endure more than anyone realizes. And some days that weight feels heavy, heavy in the chest, heavy in the bones, heavy in the way you start to crave someone who can look past your stillness and say, I know you feel this, even if you're not showing it. Calm. People aren't unbothered. They're just done wasting their spirit on things that don't matter. They've been hurt by their own reactions before, so now they choose their battles like they choose their oxygen, intentionally, carefully, with reverence for their own peace. And more than anything, calm people know this truth. Reacting is easy. Staying grounded is sacred. And sacred things are often misunderstood, but they hold on to that calmness anyway, even when it costs them connection, even when people misread them, even when they feel invisible in rooms where noise is the currency. Because calmness is the one thing they refuse to lose. It's the last shelter they built inside themselves when the world gave them none on the outside. So if you are one of those people, the ones who hold storms quietly, the ones who feel deeply but show it softly, the ones who stay composed while your heart is shaking, hear this. Your calmness is not a flaw. It is not emptiness. It is not detachment. It is evidence of evolution, of depth, of survival. You are not unfeeling. You are unshakable. And that is something the world will never fully understand. But you don't need it to, because calmness isn't something you perform. It's something you become. There comes a moment, and maybe you've felt this too, when calmness stops being something you practice and becomes something you are. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, quietly, the way dawn overtakes the sky without asking permission. One day, you look at your life and realize you don't respond the way you used to. Things that once pulled you into chaos barely stir you now. People who could trigger you with a single comment suddenly feel small, distant, harmless. It's not that you stopped caring. It's that you stopped carrying what wasn't yours. You started valuing your energy the way you should have all along. And that shift changes everything. You begin to notice how rarely you explain yourself anymore, how little you defend your intentions, how uninterested you've become in proving your worth. You're no longer fighting to be understood, because finally, deeply, you understand yourself. That's the transformation nobody talks about, the moment you stop needing external permission to exist your way. It's subtle, but it's life-altering. You begin choosing silence over noise, not because you're avoiding conflict, but because peace matters more than winning. You stop engaging in arguments that go nowhere because you can see the ending before the conversation even begins. You can sense which battles are built on ego and which ones are actually worth showing up for. Most aren't. And that used to bother you. Now it liberates you. You start walking away sooner, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. You stop chasing people who make you feel unseen. You stop explaining your boundaries to those who benefit from you not having any. You stop forcing connections that don't feel reciprocal. That's the real transformation. Not the calmness itself, but the clarity that calmness gives you. And here's the strange part. People notice. They feel the shift, even if they don't understand it. Some will be drawn to you, curious about your quiet confidence. Others will feel threatened because your stillness exposes their noise. Your peace highlights their chaos. Your boundaries reveal their lack of them. And without saying a word, you start transforming rooms just by being in them. But the most profound change happens internally. You begin trusting yourself again. You make decisions without asking 10 people for reassurance. You listen to your intuition without second-guessing it. You stop waiting for signs, because you finally realize you are one. Your life becomes less about reacting and more about choosing, less about fear and more about alignment, less about going back and more about becoming. That's the moment calmness becomes more than survival. It becomes identity, it becomes direction, it becomes who you are when no one is watching. And once you reach that place, everything that comes next is different. There's a point on this path where you stop breaking the way you used to, not because life becomes easier, but because you become deeper. You develop a kind of inner gravity, a groundedness that can't be knocked loose by every shift in the wind. People see calmness on the outside, but they rarely understand the architecture required to hold that stillness on the inside. Because calmness isn't just a feeling, it's a restructuring of your entire inner world. At some point, you stop depending on external stability to feel internally stable. You stop waiting for circumstances to be right before you allow yourself to breathe. You stop believing that peace only exists when everything is in your control. Instead, you build an inner foundation that stands, even when everything around you shakes. That's what makes you unshakable. Not the absence of storms, but the presence of an inner anchor the storm can't move. And that anchor is built from truth, the truth of who you are, the truth of what you will no longer allow, the truth of the boundaries you set, not to keep people out, but to keep yourself intact. You start realizing that most chaos comes from abandoning your own center, from saying yes when your body was screaming no, from shrinking your voice just to be tolerated, from ignoring the discomfort that was trying to guide you. But once you stop betraying yourself, something incredible happens. The world loses its power to shake you. Suddenly, someone's opinion doesn't hit as hard. Someone's silence doesn't feel like rejection. Someone's disappointment doesn't send you spiraling. You no longer crumble at the thought of not being liked, because you finally like yourself enough to stand on your own energy. That's the kind of internal shift that changes everything. And what's even more surprising, you stop reacting to other people's chaos as if it's your responsibility to fix it. You stop intervening to save situations that were never yours to rescue. You stop absorbing emotions that don't belong to you. You begin to understand that being empathetic doesn't mean being porous. You can feel deeply without drowning. You can care without carrying. You can love without losing yourself in the process. This is what being unshakable really means. Not that you're unaffected, but that you're aligned. That your reactions are no longer impulsive, but intentional. That you respond from clarity, not fear. That you move with purpose instead of panic. Calmness gives you that. Not because you've detached from life, but because you're finally connected to yourself. And from that place, that grounded, sovereign, quietly powerful place, life stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you navigate with awareness, with discernment, with strength that feels almost effortless. Because once you discover the calm within you, the world outside loses its ability to control you. People see the calm, the groundedness, the steady presence, and they assume it came naturally. They assume you've always been this composed, this patient, this unfazed. But what they don't see is the cost, because becoming this calm doesn't happen without losing things, without shedding illusions, without grieving who you used to be and who you used to need. Calmness asks for sacrifice. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, inner kind that most people never talk about. You lose the version of yourself that reacted to everything. You lose the identity that was built on survival, on pleasing, on managing the emotions of everyone around you. You lose the people who only knew how to love you when you were smaller, softer, less aware of your own worth. Calmness takes all of that from you before it gives anything back. The deeper you go into your own clarity, the more you realize how much of your past life ran on emotional autopilot. You didn't set boundaries, you swallowed discomfort. You didn't say, "This hurts." You said, "It's fine." You didn't honor your truth. You adjusted yourself to fit the room. And that kind of living fractures you quietly. You don't realize how much it costs until you stop doing it. When calmness arrives, the real kind, the kind born from awareness instead of suppression, it changes you in ways that make some people uncomfortable. Because suddenly you're not as easy to manipulate, not as quick to react, not as willing to explain yourself, not as available for emotional labor that drains you. Your silence becomes a boundary, your peace becomes non-negotiable, your presence becomes selective. And the moment you stop overreacting, you stop overgiving. The moment you stop overgiving, you stop overattaching. And the moment you stop overattaching, many relationships simply disappear. Not because you pushed them away, but because they were only sustained by the version of you that no longer exists. That's the cost. People who were comfortable with your chaos won't know what to do with your calm. People who relied on your emotional availability won't know how to function when you pull your energy back. People who counted on your softness might resent your strength. Calmness cleans your life in brutal ways. But here's the strange thing. The more you lose, the more you gain. You gain the ability to hear yourself clearly. You gain peace that isn't conditional on someone else's mood. You gain relationships rooted in truth instead of performance. You gain a sense of self-respect that is worth more than any external validation ever gave you. And most importantly, you gain yourself. Not the version who reacted to survive, but the version who responds to life. Calmness costs you your old life, but in return, it gives you a new one. One that finally feels like yours. There comes a moment, after all the breaking, after all the shedding, after all the quiet transformations no one saw, when you start to return to yourself. Not the old self, not the version shaped by fear or scarcity or emotional survival. Not the one who reacted to everything just to feel in control. That person is gone, and they're not coming back. The return I'm talking about is different. It's the return to the person you were before the world taught you who to be. The return to the soul underneath the noise. The return to the self that was always there, buried, but waiting. And the strange thing is, after everything you've lived through, this return doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost gentle, like walking back into a room you left years ago, only to discover it never locked behind you. You begin noticing this return in subtle ways. You don't rush to fill silence anymore. You don't panic when someone pulls away. You don't collapse when plans fall apart. You don't beg for clarity. You create it. The storms that once swallowed you now pass through you. Not because you're numb, but because you finally understand the difference between what's yours to carry and what isn't. You return to your breath, your intuition, your inner pace, your inner voice, the one that was drowned out for years by overthinking, fear, and other people's expectations. And when you return to yourself, you also return to your power. Not power over anyone else, just power over your own reactions, your own energy, your own choices. You stop letting chaos dictate your direction. You stop letting guilt drive your decisions. You stop letting fear choose your future. People will notice the shift, even if they don't understand it. They'll feel it before they can name it, because there is something unmistakable about someone who has returned to themselves after being lost for so long. It's in the stillness, in the groundedness, in the I don't need to impress you softness, in the I know who I am now calm. And this return changes how you move through the world. You start saying no without apologizing. You start choosing peace over adrenaline. You start valuing depth over attention. You start recognizing who can meet you and who can't. The loneliness shifts too. It doesn't sting the same way. It becomes a companion instead of a punishment, a space you protect instead of something you escape. And slowly, you begin attracting people who resonate with your new frequency, people who aren't intimidated by your honesty, people who don't need you chaotic to feel comfortable, people who don't ask you to shrink so they can feel bigger. When you return to yourself, your world reorganizes, not instantly, not perfectly, but undeniably. Because calmness changes not only how you survive, it changes how you live, how you love, how you choose, how you show up, even when life tries to shake you again. And that's the real beauty of this return. You come back softer but stronger, quieter but more certain, less reactive but more alive, less afraid but more aware, awake, unburdened, unbecoming everything that wasn't truly you, so you can finally return to everything that is. If you've made it all the way here, then you already know something most people don't. Calmness isn't who you were born as. It's who you became, after life forced you to decide what kind of person you were going to be, when the world refused to make it easy. You didn't become calm because everything went well. You became calm because life shook you until you had no choice but to learn how to hold your own center. You became calm because reacting was killing you, because overthinking was draining you, because caring too much about the wrong things was burning you alive from the inside out. And one day, something broke. Not you, just the illusion of who you thought you had to be. You stopped fighting storms you couldn't control. You stopped explaining yourself to people who weren't listening. You stopped abandoning yourself to keep peace that wasn't even real. And in that moment, you didn't lose your power. You found it. This calm you carry now, it's the mark of someone who has lived, someone who has fallen apart and rebuilt themselves with intention, someone who has lost illusions and gained clarity, someone who no longer chases what doesn't align with their soul. So here's the truth I want you to walk away with. Your calm is not emptiness. Your calm is wisdom. Your calm is earned. Your calm is your rebellion. Your calm is the proof that you no longer live at the mercy of everything that happens around you. And if you're listening to this, if these words resonate, it's because you're already on that path too. Maybe not fully, maybe not consistently, but you're awakening. You're shifting. You're letting the noise fall away. You're becoming someone you don't have to abandon anymore. So stay with it. Stay with you. Choose peace, not numbness. Choose presence, not performance. Choose honesty, not approval. And above all, choose the version of you that feels like truth, even if the world doesn't recognize them yet. Because one day it will, and when it does, you'll already be long gone from who you used to be. Stay awake, stay steady, stay becoming.